Entry 41, Thursday, July 2nd, another half-page entry, covers two different topics.
The commission did meet on Thursday, July 2, to complete its review of the 72 factual questions that had been put before the members by the Chief Justice. Rankin reported that virtually all of those additional questions had been resolved by the commission without any major issue except in the area of presidential protection. And he reported that there were two members of the commission that did support a transfer of some, if not all, of the presidential protection function to the Department of Justice. I knew that one of those was Dulles, and I expected that the other was Congressman Ford. But the commission had decided to try to reconcile the differences among them on this subject, and they decided to consider the matter in the future in an effort to seek some compromise that was acceptable to all 7 members. In the afternoon, the commission did hear testimony from Mr. Lane, and I think we discussed this earlier, that the focus became on his denial that he had recorded a telephone conversation with witness Helen Markham, but that in fact he had, and the subject of that recorded interview was provided to the commission, and later on it was demonstrated that he really had not accurately reported on his conversation with Mrs. Markham regarding her description of the shooter of Patrolman Tippett.
Did you stress to Rankin that the Attorney General was really wanting the commission to look into the presidential protection issue?
I think I probably reported that, but I think I've also said that he and Redlick were singularly uninterested in proceeding that. I think because of their view, correctly held, that there was not strong support on the commission for that.
Right. Okay. All right. We'll go to the next entry. Entry 42, one of a series of shorter entries. This one is from Friday, July 3rd, 1964, running half a page. What's the subject of this?
Well, by this time, the commission had resolved most of the questions, and the findings and the recommendations were an important element in what would be the first chapter of the report. It would include such matters as the creation of the commission and the initial facts regarding the assassination, and then end up with a set of conclusions and recommendations. That part of the first chapter couldn't really be done until the commission had gone through the motions of making these decisions. And so it was appropriate to begin to outline that document. Rankin told Norman and myself that the Chief Justice was planning to leave the country the following Monday or Tuesday, and this discussion we were having was on Friday, and he wanted a portion of the report dealing with conclusions and recommendations before he left. So as a result, Norman and I spent time on Thursday and Friday to produce a document which apparently was written primarily in my office with Rankin standing by to contribute, which I described as circumstances that weren't the most conducive to enlightened work, and I thought the end product was not particularly good. But nevertheless, it was done at the Chief Justice's request. It was delivered to him Friday evening, and he submitted his comments to Rankin at a meeting on Monday, July 6th, and Norman and I were instructed to incorporate those suggestions the next time around. So it's an example of the Chief Justice responding promptly to portions of the report that he thought were not particularly controversial, and once he signed off, we were able to incorporate his suggestions, refine it as we thought appropriate, but consider it nearly a final part of the report.
Another example also of you being asked at the last minute to do something completely big and time-consuming in a very short span of time. So,
well, that was our job, is to be responsive and do the work.
you did that many times in the course of this. All right, we'll go ahead to the next entry then. In entry 43 from Tuesday, July 7th of 64, running half a page, less than half a page, it really is primarily about a reception that you attended where you saw the Attorney General.
Yeah, it's basically a social a note that there was a United States Attorney's Conference at the Department of Justice, and then there was on that evening a reception at the Attorney General's home, and my wife and I went to Bob Kennedy's home for this event, and in passing he asked me about the report. I told him that we were making it every effort to produce it as quickly as possible and hoped it would be done before the Democratic Convention.
Because that was a concern.
Yeah, it was a concern, and the convention was scheduled to open on Monday, August 17. So at this point, that was about 5 weeks off, and I don't know that I thought we really had a chance to complete it by then. But I thought, if the Chief Justice continued to work with such efficiency, there was a possibility that it might be done.
All right, next entry. Entry 44 from Thursday, July 9th of 64, another half-page entry, a little bit about a psychological analysis of Oswald.
The staff organized a conference with 3 qualified psychiatrists to see if they could provide any judgment or observations about Oswald. We provided the 3 doctors with fairly extensive materials, including Oswald's diary, correspondence that he wrote to his brother, and other materials that pertain to his time in Russia, and of course the judgment of a counselor back who looked at Oswald as a truancy case in either his elementary school or high school years in New York City. So I attended portions of it, and I did think it was useful to have that kind of conversation, although the conclusion was not unexpected. The conclusion of the 3 psychiatrists was that they could not, on the basis of these written materials alone, really make any determinative judgment. And I say in the entry that it was a major victory for Norman and a major defeat for Liebler, which probably overstates the issue. I think Jim was thinking for more specific guidance in his search for a motive, and if there was a psychiatric analysis that identified some well-known deficiency, whether it's bipolar problems or whatever, that would help clarify his writing. And I don't think he really had much of a investment in anything, although, as we'll learn later, he thought there was a bias among the staff not to emphasize the fact that Oswald was a declared a Marxist, period. So what is interesting is that the psychiatrist did conclude and that certain factors contributed to Oswald's motives and characteristics, and the factors were Oswald's overriding hostility to his environment, his inability to establish meaningful relationships with other people, his perpetual discontent with the world around him, his expressions of hatred for American society, and his actions to protest against it, his doomed search for a perfect society, and his desire for recognition as a great man. And it seems to me that does cover the range of some very important deficiencies or attributes or characteristics. And there's just on a reading of those, it drives home so many aspects of his personality that contributed to, one could argue, taking such a desperate action as assassinating the president to express his hostility to express his desire for a change in political structure and to declare himself a great man by changing the face of history.
Well, what sets Oswald apart, of course, from Booth and Guiteau and Czolgosz with the other presidential assassinations is that Oswald claimed he didn't shoot anyone. He defended that. He defended himself until his dying breath. And while all the other presidential assassins in history have been very proud of what they consider a political or patriotic act. Is that frustrating to you?
No, it's a very interesting point you make, and I often wonder what his strategy would have been at trial, whether he would have sought to oppose, deny any involvement, and I didn't quite know how. I would assume that his lawyer would look for some agreement that would. Let him plead guilty and not receive a sentence of death. But if Oswald, being the kind of person he was, he might well have tried to argue that he was taken advantage of and wasn't involved whatsoever, notwithstanding all the evidence that was there. And I wondered at some time whether he might change positions and use it as a podium, to express his views about the American political system and so forth and so on. That seems unlikely.
Well, we'll never know. It's one of the tantalizing aspects of this case that just goes on and on. Ruby created a whole mountain of issues by silencing Oswald 48 hours after the assassination. All right, we'll move on to the next entry.